Our next speaker, and I hope is Dr. Elliott Campbell. He's an assistant professor at the School of Engineering at the University of California Merced Energy Research Institute. His primary research efforts include sustainable bioenergy assessment and chemical transport modeling and looking at the carbon cycle interactions. He is a consultant to the UN Environmental Program, the US EPA, the GAO, California Council on Science and Technology, and the Chile EPA. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for joining us from California today. I'm sure it's perhaps a little warmer there now than it is here, but we'll find out. Dr. Elliott Campbell.
All right. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be participating in this. I'm getting a little echo here. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Perhaps it'd be helpful if you speak slowly because of the way the feedback's coming.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting a pretty bad echo. Can other saying turn down the volume?
I'm sorry. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you twice.
Elliott, this is Christine.
But I think that's okay.
Are you listening to us on the webcast at the same time? Because I think that's giving you your feedback. So either just have the phone on or just use the computer.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just have the phone. I'm still getting the feedback, but that's okay. It works. So we just heard about really localized emissions, tailpipe scale, and here I'd like to take a different perspective, bring us to the regional scale with respect to health and climate change impacts on biofuels. So for starters, one of the spatial scales we typically hear about with respect to climate impacts is global scale. And there's a couple of competing issues there that Tim Searchiner's talk provided great information on, and that's that you've got this ideal carbon cycle depicted on the left here, the photosynthesis taken up by biomass feedstock that really makes the carbon neutral energy source. At the same time, you have the potential for land change that could provide some leakage, lead to significant carbon emissions, biofuels production. So there's a lot of work going on global scale for understanding climate impacts.
Elliott, this is Christine
again. At the same time...
Elliott, this is Christine. Could you please mute your computer speakers?
Oh, okay. They're muted. There's sound coming out of my computer. But I'm happy to adjust anything else if there's something else you can think of.
Okay, are we ready to move forward? That's great. Elliott, please do speak. Dr. Campbell?
Okay, thank you. All right, so that's the typical scale that you think about, but there's emerging concerns at the regional scale too. So on the left here, we see a plot of the Los Angeles region here, where Mark Jacobson has used a regional air quality model to look at the potential impact of broad use of E85 versus business as usual, where gasoline is the dominant fuel source, and showing the potential for enhanced air quality impact, and at least in this specific case for ozone. Regional modeling can also be pretty helpful understanding climate aspects as well. So on the right is a plot from Georgescu and colleagues looking at the regional climate impacts that would result in a broad cultivation of second-generation cellulose ethanol crops, and their changes in the land surface scale for albedo, evapotranspiration, these types of things. And in this case, you get a cooling effect, so potentially offsetting some of these direct end-use impacts associated with changes to the carbon cycle. There's been quite a bit of work on the U.S., but at the regional scale in Brazil, there's a need for more work, and I'll show you some emerging analysis of the regional climate and regional health impacts that may be associated with biofuels production in Brazil. So a quick primer on Brazil here is shown in the top plot. You see that the consumption and production of liquid fuels are on the same scale. From an electric power point of view, on the lower plot, you see that hydroelectricity is really dominating the mix there for energy production. So significant concerns for not only liquid fuel exports, biofuels, but also potentially diversifying the local electricity production. So one thing that we began to look at here is the potential to use a significant biomass resource that's right now lost during the feedstock for ethanol production in Brazil with the sugarcane. And in the picture here at the top, you see that the pre-harvest burning there, which is done for a variety of agronomic reasons. Basically, you lose a significant portion of the biomass to the atmosphere. Converting some of that biomass, we can shift to a more mechanized approach to harvesting. Can provide significant benefits for diversifying the electricity production in Brazil. But an additional alternative is converting that biomass, if you can harvest it instead of burn it, into ethanol cellulose conversion process. This, of course, isn't what's done primarily right now. Maybe half of the sugarcane production is done with this pre-harvest burning in the Sao Paulo region. So it shows the potential for significant air quality impacts, but also climate impacts. So the new work that I'd like to describe is how we understand what these emissions are, how we map those emissions into health and climate impacts, and the potential for a whole other range of emission sources from indirect emissions. Okay, so direct emissions. One approach to going after these is to use a bottom-up approach, basically emission factors from grease, maps of sugarcane production produced by Manfreda and colleagues, and basic conversion factors from other agronomic and life cycle assessment data. What you see in terms of emissions for different species is shown here. In the upper left, we see a range of species on the x-axis here. The y-axis is the magnitude of these species. And the different colors show you the different life cycle phases. So the field burning that was shown in the images on the previous slide is these red bars. And the other bars are what we typically think about for emissions from ethanol, from farming, at the ethanol refinery stage, from vehicle use, and so on. And you can see really quickly that these field burning emissions are massive across most species, except for NOx and SOx relative to the other stages. So field burning is a really important component to consider. The growth in emissions over time is also an important factor here. So here the x-axis is years, the y-axis is emissions, the different lines, the different colors are different species, but despite the shift towards mechanization, there's still a growing increase in the amount of field burning that's going on simply due to an expansion of the sugarcane areas, and this is for Sao Paulo State in Brazil, where most of the production currently is occurring. There's other information that we've used in the past to try and get a sense of what these emissions are. The plots here give you a sense of remote sensing-based information on what the emissions in this region are from the field burning, which is thought to dominate the emissions. You can see a number of plots here in red, in green, and purple are basically satellite estimates. In blue are the bottom-up estimates from this study, so we show a potential for a significant underestimate coming from the top-down data, which has basically been broadly available for lots of sugarcane production regions previously. One important question is why the difference, because we'd love to be able to use the remote sensing data, and there's a number of factors here. The burned areas are different between the bottom-up and satellite-based versions of these emissions. The fuel loading, how much biomass per area is different, and so are the emission factors. And they're summed up in this paper here by Zhao and colleagues, but the important story here is that the burned areas are massively different. They're really largely underestimated. Fuel loadings and emission factors will really vary from study to study, but here we see almost a factor of 4 difference between the bottom-up and top-down estimates. Some of the spatial distributions for those differences are shown as well. Okay, so we're getting better at getting a sense of what the emissions are from this important life cycle stage from Brazilian biofuels, from this pre-harvest burning. What might the health and climate impacts be? And so the approach for trying to understand that is to first figure out the air quality change, not just the emissions change, but how do the atmospheric species change in concentration, and how does that change in space and time? Another important piece of information for quantifying the human health effect is determining the exposed populations, also a health effect estimate and a health baseline incidence. And you can try and gather these data at a variety of spatial scales in Brazil, which is shown here, where we can use province level, county level, or country level data. The health response also can be drawn from a variety of studies, and to get a good sense of uncertainty, you really need to include all of these. And the change in the atmospheric concentration comes from these regional atmospheric models that I talked about previously. And here we see maps of the difference for adding sugarcane ethanol production versus not having it for within the season where the pre-harvest burning occurs, outside of it in January, and within it in May. And then when you apply this health impacts analysis, you can get a sense of the spatial distribution of that emission source from the pre-harvest burning. If you scale from just those 2 maps to an annual estimate, you get somewhere between 20 and 4,000 deaths per billion gallons of ethanol. And to compare that to previous work done on the U.S. Domain for a similar quantity of ethanol, a billion gallons of ethanol in the U.S., you can see results from Hill and colleagues are somewhere in between those numbers. So it's a huge extent, 20 to 4,000, but at least from this preliminary analysis, it seems that there is significant potential for these health impacts to be quite large from this pre-harvest burning. Climate forcing is also difficult to determine. It requires advanced climate modeling. But if you use climate forcing factors based on emissions per black carbon from the fields and from the boilers at the ethanol refinery, you can see that the climate forcing per unit energy of ethanol for sugarcane can increase from what we think of it as now to something that may exceed regulatory thresholds if you add in this black and red bar for this aerosol-related forcing that may be associated with the pre-harvest burning and the ethanol refinery. Lastly, I just want to say a bit about the potential for indirect emissions. That the field burning is a direct emission, but I'll just skip to this slide here and then probably move on to recommendations. That there's also the potential from these air quality and aerosol climate forcing related emissions from indirect sources. And these plots here show the potential for PM2.5 emissions from indirect land use change associated with ethanol production in Brazil. The two top plots here show emissions from where here F to B is forest converted to biofuels cultivation. The big one here is rangeland converted to biofuels production in the top plot for PM2.5 emissions, and that's on the order of 2 teragrams. But if you go to the second plot here, part B, you can see that the scale of the y-axis is much larger, going up to 25, and the forest to rangeland conversion from indirect land use change that may occur can be the largest of all in terms of emissions of PM2.5 from potential indirect land use change. If you figure this back into the overall life cycle of the sugarcane ethanol, and you look at this across different species, you can see that the conventional gasoline is shown here in red. In orange is the life cycle of ethanol, sugarcane ethanol without land use change. And then the yellow, green, and blue bars are the emissions just from this land use change component. And for PM2.5 in particular, you can see that the indirect land use change could add significantly, as much as doubling the total emissions without including land use change. If you compare these indirect land use change emissions with respect to the deforestation that's occurring now for PM2.5, that you could see that adding 1 billion gallons of ethanol is on the order of, potentially on the order of all the emissions from deforestation in roughly the last decade. Okay, so summary is that the emerging trade regime for biofuels, where Brazilian biofuels can be exported to developed nations, presents really important leakage challenges with respect to regional health and regional climate impacts. One of the important ways that we try and assess these is by knowing the extent of burned area from some of the direct emissions associated with pre-harvest burning. And right now, our top-down and bottom-up estimates differ by as much as a factor of 4. The sugarcane regional health impacts could be potentially much larger than other biofuels, but there's still much work needed there to really quantify that number and the uncertainty in that number. And the regional climate impacts have the potential to switch sugarcane ethanol from really a solution, from having a nice reduction in climate impacts relative to the fossil fuels they replace, to potentially having a warming, at least at a regional scale. And the recommendations here is first for research that Brazil is an important domain for understanding regional climate and regional health impacts, just from looking at this preliminary data. And in particular, the research gaps that should be addressed, the top-down burned area, being able to better resolve this, observation-based emission factors, because they vary widely, and three-dimensional atmospheric modeling to test a wide range of hypotheses about how these impacts might actually look for different emission scenarios. The last point here is that there really is a need to integrate the research and policy results associated with these regional impacts to address the important leakage areas, leakage issues, in addition to the current, probably larger focus on global impacts. And I want to acknowledge funding we received to carry out some of the work I've shown you, and colleagues at Iowa, at the University of Andrés Bello in Chile, and other colleagues here at UC Merced. Thank you.
Well, thank you.